This is Grace McCarty, the UCSC humanities intern with KSQD. The Pajaro Valley has long been home to farm workers from around the world who came to harvest the fruits and vegetables that are grown there. Thousands of Filipino laborers migrated to the region at the beginning of the last century, creating a rich cultural history spanning generations. Filipino American stories in the Pajaro Valley have been overlooked, especially by its neighboring universities. But recently, researchers at UCSC have been working to change this. As part of the Watsonville in the Heart project, the research works to expand the narrative of Filipino American studies, re-examining the lives of laborers and their descendants. In April, the exhibit, Sowing Seeds, Filipino American Stories from the Pajaro Valley, opened at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. Exploring Filipino migration from the 1930s to the present, it highlights archival photographs and heirlooms, contemporary art, and notable oral histories to create a public record that reflects the community it represents. When I got to the exhibit, there was a feeling of quiet reverence in the room. Some families walked around the collections talking quietly with each other. Others walked alone in complete silence. I asked visitors what they took away from reading about Filipino history in the area.
So growing up in Santa Cruz, I really briefly remember in probably one history class for like a day, they briefly mentioned Filipino history in Watsonville, and ever since then I have not heard a single peep about it, and this is really the first time I've been able to get a full education on their history and just how deep the roots go in our county.
So as someone who is Mexican American myself, who comes from a community where there are not a lot of Mexican Americans, I think that it's important that these niche areas that cover different ethnic groups who come from different immigrant communities is very important because it can speak to the experiences of a lot of different people that we might not be thinking about.
Throughout the exhibit, there are a series of photographs of Filipino American immigrants in the Pajaro Valley. One is an old picture of a woman outside in a garden. She is surrounded by wide open fields of flowers and looks straight into the camera with a quiet strength that seems almost modern for the time. It is a picture of Lauren Kowaling's mother, a first-generation Filipino from the Pajaro Valley. He talks about how dangerous it was for his mother and other workers at the canneries in Watsonville. The following voice of Lauren Kowaling is an excerpt of the oral history collection.
I love this picture. My mom had a green thumb. Everybody used to tell us, man, your mom's yard, this and that. She had beautiful flowers in the front yard. It was always colorful all the time. She did like everybody else. Everybody worked in the canneries back in the old days. That original Green Giant cannery sat at the corner of Walker Street and Beach Street. And I want to say back in the 60s when my mom was working, it employed a lot of people. There was no OSHA regulations back then and stuff. My mom used to tell me stories about accidents there where, let's say, no one was wearing a hairnet. I remember a story that she said that somebody got their hair caught in a piece of machinery. Nobody got killed or anything, but, she was telling me that somebody got hurt. My Manang Rosie used to work there. I think my Auntie Lita used to work there just because that was like one of the first processing plants in the area and everybody wanted to get a job there. I remember her putting her hairnet on and, my dad would drop her off in front of the factory before he had to go to work in the fields or whatever. And then come back and pick her up later on.
The audio guide helps put these voices in context for visitors.
During our interview with Lauren Kowaling, he showed us this photograph of his mother, Aladina Kowaling, standing in a field of flowers. The photograph elicited memories of Lauren's mother, including her fondness for gardening and her experiences working in the canneries. Many Manang worked in the food processing industry, including canneries and frozen food packaging factories, and this interview captures their labor. Watsonville, dubbed the frozen food capital of the world during the 1980s, was the hub for food processing, in part because of Manang labor. In this interview, Lauren recalls the hardships his mother endured while working at Green Giant, one of the major canneries in the area.
That was UCSC professor Kathleen Gutierrez, the co-curator of Sowing Seeds and the lead researcher within Watsonville's in the Heart. She is also a historian of science in Southeast Asia. Dr. Gutierrez came across Watsonville in an archival letter from the Philippines that discussed the racial violence of the region. She was first introduced to Watsonville's in the Heart back in 2019, when a Filipino community organizer, Ro Recchio, came to UC Santa Cruz to curate stories of Filipino immigrants.
I came across Watsonville, funnily enough, through a botany archive. And I was studying the archive of this one botanist who, by the 1930s, was based in New York, and he had spent about 20 years in the Philippines. And he received a letter from one of his colleagues in the Philippines who during the Great Depression was interested in moving to the United States because he thought that there would be more opportunities. And he asked that botanist, is the racial feeling in the New York as intense as it is in California? Or as violent as it is in Watsonville? Our main community partner, Roy Rescio, had started this exhibition called originally Watsonville is in the Heart in early 2020 that had opened at the Watsonville Public Library. So he cared about exhibitions. It was important to him to be able to display and to promote Filipino American history locally. When Roy Rescio approached me, I was eager and I knew that I wanted to be involved with the local Filipino community in some way. I felt like a duty and an interest to support him in some way. I would never deny the intense privilege one has working at the university. And we come with a lot of resources, a lot of backing, and a lot of institutional support that could really change the nature of a community engaged project, not always for the better, but certainly we have certain machinery that could help. And so I saw it as a responsibility to Roy, and also as a person who came from a historical Filipino enclave myself. I knew that this was also going to be part of me trying to develop and find home out here in the Central Coast, too.
Filipino American migration significantly increased at the start of the 20th century, when over 100,000 laborers were recruited to work in U.S. agricultural fields and canneries. The Pajaro Valley, the agricultural driver of Santa Cruz County, became a center for an influx of young and single Filipino men, known as mangang, Tagalog for little brother. The Sowing Seeds exhibition centers around 4 central themes that structure these experiences: labor, gender, conflict, and memory, responding to the history of gendered and racialized violence that has occurred in Watsonville. Relationships between white women and Filipino migrants caused tensions to rise within the region, culminating in the Watsonville race riots of 1930, a period of violence from white men against Filipinos that spanned multiple days. Over 500 white men gathered outside a Filipino-owned taxi dance club with mobs and clubs, threatening to take out the 9 white women who worked there. The violence spread around the city. 22 Filipino-American men were dragged out of a labor camp out into the streets and beaten vigorously. Fermin Tobera died at age 22 after being shot in the heart while he was hiding in a closet with 11 others, trying to avoid the rounds of bullets fired at a bunkhouse in Murphy Ranch in San Juan Road on January 23rd. In Sowing Seeds, scenes of racial tension are remembered and memorialized, but the experiences are also expanded upon to create more nuanced depictions of cultural memory. As the Asian American historical experience in Watsonville has been so shrouded by violence, layered experiences from many stages of life are provided, creating a deeper understanding of the settings we find these voices in, and a glimpse of everyday life. In the audio guide, Dr. Gutierrez narrates us through childhood memories of various sites of cultural importance in Watsonville, while her husband provides instrumental music to further root us in the scene.
To ensure a steady flow of migrant farm workers, farm owners built labor camps where many manong and manang lived with their children. The design and condition of these housing units varied. Some were built as barracks, where many transient men would live. Others housed single families. Typically, they were maintained to barely passable conditions, but manong and manang transformed them into homes where they could relax and play. In this interview, Shirley Ancheta, the daughter of Julio Valiente and Delfina Rivera Ancheta, describes a typical scene in a labor camp. The interview is paired with a photograph from the Cowaling family collection, which depicts manong inside of a camp on their day off.
Who else?
Yeah, usually it was the same cook. There'd be one person sitting at a table playing solitaire. There'd be a Playboy calendar on the wall somewhere, or a Mexican calendar on the wall somewhere from a grocery store. And there would be lots of food. The women who would come, like the wives, like my mom and other people, they get busy cooking the pastries, the things that she would make out of the sweet rice flour and fry up and put the brown sugar and stuff on top of it and the coconut milk. So they would get busy doing that while the men did the butchering and they go down to the beach if it was low tide and do the mussels. My brother and I, our parents would say, okay, we're going to camp. And we thought, well, why are we going to go to the real camp? Because we were thinking summer camp. You always say we're going to go to camp and we're going to go see those guys. And my mom would say, don't talk like that, because these are our friends. They got stuck over here. This is their life.
Dr. Gutierrez has a background in the history of science and learned about the method of conducting oral histories that make up the Sowing Seeds exhibit over a long period of time. She became interested in the aspects of collaboration that make community history so unique, specifically in developing the practice of oral history.
And I have to say, I think when I found myself out the gate, I really found myself loving the method. The method is exciting. I think it calls for a lot of patience and earnest curiosity. And I think because I also was not trained in Filipino American studies, I didn't have an agenda. I don't know if I was looking for an intellectual answer. I don't know if I was even looking to kind of prove some theory, that has sort of abounded in the scholarship around Filipino American studies or Asian American studies. I really went in kind of as green and as a novice with that kind of, curiosity that I think helps keep conversations going.
Professor Gutierrez said that the rigors of publishing in academia and the pressure to produce can be at odds with the slow pace of building relationships, especially in a community project that asks people to tell their own personal stories.
So much of academia can seem like an individualist pursuit, especially in the humanities. It's a little different in STEM, I think, where we might expect a lab to have multiple people, multiple co-authors at the end of the day for a particular project. But the humanities has long been about, individual intelligence and genius kind of hitting the pages. And I think this project has really, really underscored the opportunity in working with such a big team. I think things absolutely do take longer. And because we pursue co-authorship with our community partners, it means that we have to really go back to the drawing board multiple times over to ensure that their visions are being met to the best that we can and really balanced out with the kind of visions that we're trying to bring into the project. And so, sure, like if I were to do this alone, maybe things could go faster, but I don't think they'd be nearly as expansive, robust, innovative in insight.
As a Filipino American woman herself, Dr. Gutierrez spoke to me about how this project related to her own identity.
I can walk into a room and for the most part be racialized as Filipino. And for a long time, I would identify myself as Phil-Am, and that was about it. It was just a given as being part of the diaspora and being a second generation kid here in the United States. My family arrived in the 1980s, and I was the only one of my family born here. So, being Filipino American and growing up, especially among a lot of Filipino Americans, meant that it was a given, and that's about it. And I think since working on this project, I'd have to say maybe a couple of things have sort of come to mind. The first is recognition that, Filipino American studies is really kind of vast and incredible. Again, not my area of specialization, but has been enjoyable to get to read and understand.
Dr. Gutierrez mentioned one interview she did with Juanita Sule Wilson, a community figure from Watsonville who spoke about her memories growing up in the Watsonville area. Juanita explains her experiences dealing with prejudice as a young girl. Here's Juanita and her interview with Dr. Gutierrez.
You identified as kind of the only ethnic family in the neighborhood. Did it feel like that, though? Did you feel different ethnic compared to the other kids? Or the other Italian kids?
Well, yeah, you kind of had to. Yeah. People deny it, like people I went to school with and stuff deny that there was no prejudice, but there was. But my mother always had an answer for it. Like, I guess I used to come home crying from school, and my mother would tell me, don't pay attention. They're ignorant people. And then I guess she would talk to the aunties, and then she came back with a story for me. And she would tell me the story, and then, we just ignored them. Right. So, and we were kept very close to home. The only time we left was to go to school. Other than that, our whole social was around the community. I was always asked, where you come from? What are you? I'm Filipino. I would say, not knowing I wasn't supposed to say that, but that's how we were raised. We were raised to be proud of who we were.
On the meaning of sowing seeds, Dr. Gutierrez describes the duality of the name. She explained that the experience she had witnessing people experience this exhibit has sown seeds in itself.
Sowing seeds has both a literal meaning, but also a metaphorical meaning as you can expect. And for me, I think sowing seeds refers to the history of agrarian farm labor, which we deeply care about in the project, and kind of the potential of growing something, whether that is community historical preservation, whether that is community formation in the face of racial duress and exclusion. And I think for me, it's, again, this kind of phrase that points to potential for something more. And it's my hope, too, that people leave the exhibition feeling pretty excited to kind of sow their own seeds for their own community historical preservation as well. I think an exhibition is an interesting format for history. And so I think bringing it to Santa Cruz is important because there were Filipinos here. There were a lot of Filipinos here at one point in time. And this was an important place for many people who lived in the Pajaro Valley too. And so, this is not to say that there aren't still Filipinos here too. I was there for the opening night, and I have to say that was probably the most emotional I've gotten. There have been a lot of emotional moments during the life of this project, but that night in particular kind of really opened some of the floodgates, and we had a kind of smaller preview of the exhibition that the curator led, and there's a great animated film that the curator put in the exhibition, and the animated film covers one of our main community contributors, and I got to see his face as he saw the film play in the gallery, and oh gosh, it floored me. It just floored me. We gave each other a hug at the end of that tour, and I heaved, like I cried in his arms even harder when I just kind of recalled not only his devotion to our work, but really his real love for his parents and the way that he spoke of them.
Although the museum shows the reality of the struggles faced by Filipino Americans in the Pajaro Valley, it is also a celebration of the perseverance of their rich cultural histories that have long been unrecognized. The nuances provided by a community history can demonstrate the complexities of human experiences, oral accounts that remember the good with the bad and the everything in between. The objects of reverence in this exhibit are not dusty artifacts from thousands of years ago, but memories of real people, some who might be standing right beside you. Sowing Seeds, Filipino American Stories from the Pajaro Valley will continue with the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History until August 4th. This is Grace McCarty, UCSC's humanities intern, and this is KSQD.